The morning started like any other, the same roll call, the same routine, the same steady rhythm of boots on concrete echoing across the base. She stood tall in her pressed uniform, the one she'd earned through sweat, discipline, and quiet perseverance. Every stitch carried a story. Every patch was a piece of her struggle. But to some, those stories didn't matter. They only saw rules, not reasons. When the order came, it hit like a slap. Asterisk, remove the uniform. You're not authorized to wear it. Asterisk, the words cut through the air, sharp and final. She blinked once, certain she'd misheard. The officer's tone left no space for confusion. Around her, heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The room thickened with silence. She felt every gaze on her, some curious, some judgmental, others quietly sympathetic. The uniform that once gave her belonging now made her an outsider. It was supposed to represent unity, strength, purpose. Yet in that moment, it marked her as someone who didn't belong. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs. She had followed every rule, met every standard, done everything asked of her and more. Yet there she stood, accused of crossing an invisible line. It wasn't about the uniform, not really. It was about permission, about power, about who was seen as deserving to wear it and who wasn't. She wanted to explain, to speak up, to remind them of what she had done, of what she had lost, of why she wore it with pride. But the order wasn't a discussion. It was a command. She looked down at her sleeves, the faded insignia, the worn threads, the small imperfections that told of years in service. It wasn't just fabric. It was memory, loyalty, sacrifice stitched into every seam. But regulations were regulations, and defiance could cost her everything. Her fingers hesitated at the buttons. The air felt colder, heavier. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the weight of a truth that no one in that room understood. The officer who had spoken stood still, unblinking, waiting for compliance. Around them, the hum of machinery, the distant shouts of training, the rhythm of life on base went on as if nothing had happened. But for her, time had slowed to a crawl. Each second stretched into an eternity. The uniform she had earned through blood and discipline had suddenly become a symbol she was being denied. She wondered if this was what erasure felt like, to have your worth questioned not because of what you've done, but because of how someone else sees you. She remembered the day she first put it on, the pride that had filled her chest, the quiet promise she'd made to serve with honor. That day, it had fit perfectly. Now, it felt heavy, almost hostile, as if the very thing that had lifted her was now pressing her down. Her mind raced through memories, the training grounds, the sleepless nights, the faces of those who hadn't made it this far. Every moment that shaped her into who she was stood in quiet defiance of the command ringing in her ears. Her throat tightened, but she refused to let her voice shake. If she had to take it off, she would do it on her own terms. She squared her shoulders, steady and composed. If they wanted submission, they wouldn't get shame along with it. She moved slowly, deliberately, not out of fear, but out of control. If this was to be her humiliation, it would also be her moment of quiet dignity. The fabric brushed against her skin one last time as she began to unfasten the top button. No one spoke. The silence grew louder, suffocating, almost electric. Some looked away, unwilling to watch. Others stared, maybe wondering why this mattered so much to her. But to her, this wasn't just about following an order. It was about being told she didn't belong in a space she had bled to earn. It was about being reminded that recognition can be taken as easily as it's given. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the second button. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Every breath felt shallow, calculated. It wasn't just embarrassment she felt. It was injustice, the sting of being unseen. The air around her seemed to hum with quiet judgment. But beneath that judgment was something stronger rising inside her. Defiance, quiet but burning. The kind that doesn't shout or fight, but simply refuses to break. Her gaze stayed fixed forward. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The uniform might be stripped away, but what it represented, her service, her integrity, her identity, couldn't be ordered off her body. Even as her fingers lingered at the fabric, She knew they could take the cloth, but not the story behind it. The order still hung in the air, waiting to be fulfilled. She took one last steady breath and prepared to obey. The silence didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, seeping through the room like a fog. The moment the words left his mouth, remove the uniform. The noise began to die. The chatter, the laughter, the faint hum of the air conditioning, even the clicking of boots on the polished floor seemed to fade. What replaced it was a thick, unmoving quiet that pressed against her skin. Every pair of eyes found her, but no one said a thing. The air grew heavier by the second, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what she'd do. She could hear the faint rustle of her own sleeves, the small shift of fabric as her body tensed. Her throat was dry, her heart was a steady, heavy drumbeat in her chest. She could almost feel the judgment being measured, the whispers that weren't yet spoken but already forming in minds around her. No one needed to say anything. The silence was loud enough. It was the kind that stripped away sound but amplified everything else. The trembling of her fingers, the sharp rhythm of her breathing, the tiny crack in her voice that she fought to keep steady. She didn't look around. She didn't want to see their faces. She didn't want to see pity or discomfort or worse, indifference. The silence was its own kind of punishment. It made her feel small, not because she believed she'd done something wrong, but because it isolated her. She stood in the middle of the room, a single figure surrounded by people who refused to move, to speak, to stand beside her. The command had been given, and now everyone was waiting to see if she'd break. The officer's eyes stayed locked on her, stern, unyielding, the kind of gaze that didn't need to raise its voice to remind her who held authority. His stance was rigid, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. His silence carried its own authority, a challenge in the stillness. He didn't need to say asterisk now. Asterisk, she knew what he wanted. But he didn't know what it cost her to comply. Somewhere to her left, a chair creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. A boot scuffed the floor. The smallest noises suddenly felt enormous. Every movement, every breath was magnified by the tension that filled the space. It was the kind of silence that demanded something, an action, a collapse, a surrender. The kind that watched and waited. She swallowed hard, the sound almost too loud in the stillness. She could feel the weight of her uniform pressing against her shoulders, the fabric suddenly stiffer, tighter, heavier. Her hands hung loosely by her sides, but her mind was racing. She thought of the long nights, the drills, the sweat, the moments when she'd almost given up but didn't. And now, here she was, standing in the same uniform that symbolized all of it, being told she didn't have the right to wear it. The silence around her seemed to whisper that maybe she never did. Her jaw clenched. There were so many things she could have said, so many words that could have filled that space, words of defense, of anger, of pride. But none of them would have mattered. She knew how it worked. In the hierarchy of command, her voice didn't hold the same weight. If she spoke, it would only make things worse. The silence demanded obedience, not explanation. So she stood still, letting it press against her until it almost hurt. Across the room, someone's gaze softened for a brief second before darting away. Even sympathy felt dangerous here. To acknowledge her humiliation was to risk sharing it. So they kept quiet, choosing safety over solidarity. The silence became a shield for them, a sentence for her. Her breathing slowed, controlled, deliberate. The silence no longer felt like an empty space. It had texture now, dense, heavy, almost suffocating. She could feel it in her bones, in the space behind her ribs, in the tightness of her jaw. It demanded composure. It demanded she prove that she could stand there, still, calm, unbroken. In that frozen moment, she noticed the smallest details, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above her, the gleam of sunlight hitting the floor through narrow windows, the way dust drifted lazily in the air, unaware of the tension it floated through. It was strange how clear everything became when no one spoke. She could see everything, feel everything, as if time had stretched thin enough for her to examine it piece by piece. The officer finally exhaled, slow and steady, a signal that time hadn't completely stopped. but his silence still filled the space like an order that hadn't yet been completed. She kept her posture straight, her chin lifted just slightly higher than before. The weight of silence could crush someone if they let it. She refused to let it crush her. It surrounded her, pressed in from all sides, but it also became something else, a kind of armor. The quiet in that room was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the sound of judgment, of waiting, of watching, of deciding. It was the sound of power being tested, of pride being measured without words. She could feel the question hanging unspoken in the air. How long could she stand before she broke? He stood near the far end of the room, watching everything unfold with the kind of stillness that made people nervous. The base commander wasn't known for outbursts or sharp reprimands. He didn't need them. His authority came from quiet observation, from the way he noticed everything others missed. So when she turned slightly, her shoulders stiff and her movements controlled, something caught his eye. A dark curve of ink peeked just above the edge of her collar. It wasn't meant to be seen, but the light caught it at just the right angle. He leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but instinct, the kind honed from years of knowing when something wasn't what it seemed. For a moment, no one else noticed. The tension in the room was still focused on her, on the uniform, on the order. She had begun to unbutton it slowly, carefully, her fingers moving with deliberate restraint. The commander's gaze stayed fixed on that faint shadow of a tattoo, the glimpse of black lines and faded edges just beneath the fabric. Something about it tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. He took a step closer, silent, his boots making no sound on the floor. The officer who had given the order didn't see him at first. He was still watching her, jaw set, expression unreadable. But the commander's approach shifted the atmosphere slightly, not enough for words, but enough for the air to change. A few heads turned as he came nearer, his presence breaking the static tension that had held the room hostage. He stopped a few feet away, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the small fragment of ink that now stood out clearly against her skin. She didn't notice him at first. Her focus was on following orders, on holding herself steady under the weight of every gaze. But when the room shifted, when the silence seemed to gain a new edge, she sensed it. Her movement slowed. She didn't turn around, didn't speak. She could feel that someone important was watching. The air around her seemed to thicken even more, carrying a gravity that pulled at her spine. The commander's eyes flicked from the tattoo to her face, then back again. It wasn't just any design. He recognized the curve of a symbol, the shape of an emblem he hadn't seen in years. His memory filled in the missing lines, a mark associated with a particular unit, one that didn't exist anymore. Disbanded, absorbed, forgotten by most. But not by him. He had commanded that unit once. He knew what it stood for, what it cost the people who wore that mark. It wasn't a decoration. It was earned through fire, through loss, through moments that still lived in nightmares. His chest tightened, not with anger but with a quiet, dawning understanding. The officer standing beside him remained unaware, still focused on the procedural infraction, a uniform worn without proper clearance. But the commander saw something else entirely. That tattoo wasn't rebellion. It was history. It was identity carved into skin because fabric and rank could be taken away, but memory could not. He stepped closer still, his shadow falling across her back. The others straightened slightly, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. The commander's gaze softened, but his voice stayed low, measured. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. His eyes told her he understood something no one else in that room did. The faint lines of the tattoo, just visible above her shoulder blade, carried a story, a connection that crossed rank and regulation. She froze, sensing his presence right behind her. She didn't know what he'd seen, didn't know what it meant yet, but she felt the shift. The silence that had once felt suffocating now trembled with a different kind of energy. Something had changed in the room, though no one could yet name it. The commander studied the lines again, the way they curved like wings, the faint scarring beneath them. It wasn't just ink. It was survival written into skin. He remembered those missions, those faces, the ones who didn't come back. And suddenly, this wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about something deeper, about loyalty, sacrifice, the unspoken bonds that outlasted orders. The officer beside him started to speak, a small, uncertain "sir" slipping out, but the commander lifted a hand, silencing him without looking away from her. The others stayed frozen, watching this quiet exchange they couldn't fully understand. She stood still, back straight, breathing slow, the tattoo now fully visible beneath the dim light. The commander's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for the people closest to him to notice. The rigid authority in his stance softened into recognition. He didn't ask how she'd earned it. He didn't need to. You didn't get that mark unless you'd been there, unless you'd endured things that didn't make it into official reports. The room remained silent, but the silence no longer felt hostile. It was waiting, not for her to finish removing the uniform, but for whatever would happen next. The commander's gaze lingered on the tattoo one last time before lifting to meet hers. For the first time since the order had been given, she allowed herself to turn slightly toward him, uncertain, guarded. The moment stretched between them, unspoken, heavy with something neither words nor rules could define. The tattoo was more than ink. It was a memory carved into her skin, a silent record of everything she'd lived through and everything she'd lost. Long before this day, before the confrontation, before anyone questioned her right to wear the uniform, there had been a night when she made a promise, one that ended up etched into her back. It wasn't meant to draw attention or spark defiance. It was a mark of survival, of belonging to something that no longer existed in name, but still lived in the people who had carried it through the worst. It had started years ago, during a mission that changed everything. The air had been thick with heat and dust, the kind that made it hard to breathe or think. They'd gone in as a team of 7, trained, confident, bound by trust. They were young, still believing that the right amount of courage could fix anything. But war doesn't honor courage. It takes and takes, until even the strongest have to decide what's worth holding on to. When the explosions started and the dust turned to smoke, she'd been the one to pull her teammate out of the wreckage, carrying him despite her own injuries. By dawn, only 3 of them were left standing. The others didn't make it home. When she came back, the military reorganized, reshuffled, and the unit she had called family was erased on paper. Their insignia was archived, their record sealed. No one spoke of it again. But she couldn't forget. None of them could. Months later, the surviving 3 met in a quiet corner of a base halfway across the world. No words were exchanged at first, just silence, and then a decision. They would mark themselves with the symbol of their fallen brothers and sisters, so that even when the world forgot, they would remember. She remembered the sting of the needle, the smell of ink mixed with antiseptic, the way the artist's hands trembled slightly when she traced the outline. The emblem wasn't large, 2 wings crossed by a line of flame, with coordinates hidden in the curves, a secret only they understood. Each line meant something: duty, sacrifice, loss, endurance. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about remembrance. When it was done, she felt something steady return to her chest, like she'd reclaimed a part of herself that had been buried under uniform codes and silence. For years, she carried it quietly beneath her clothes. It wasn't something she flaunted or mentioned. It was personal, sacred. When she put on the uniform each morning, it rested just beneath the fabric, a whisper against her skin reminding her why she served and who she served for. Every stripe, every salute, every order carried the weight of that memory. She never needed to talk about it. She just lived it. The tattoo wasn't just about loss. It was about connection. The remaining 2 from her unit still reached out every year on the same date. No speeches, no ceremonies, just a message, a photograph, sometimes a single word. They all knew what it meant. The mark wasn't visible to anyone else, but it was always there, like an unspoken vow that time and rank couldn't erase. When the new regulations came down, stricter rules about appearance, stricter boundaries about who could wear what, she didn't think the tattoo mattered. It wasn't visible. It didn't violate anything. But when one small mistake in protocol led to an inspection, someone saw the edge of it, misunderstood it, and everything spiraled. They assumed it was unauthorized, inappropriate, disrespectful. She didn't defend it. There was no point in trying to explain something they'd never understand. The tattoo wasn't about defiance of authority. It was about devotion to something greater than any one rule. As she stood now, in front of the commander, the memory of that night she got it done played in her mind. The sound of her friend's voice saying, "If they forget us, we'll remember each other." The smell of oil and sweat and dirt. The feel of the sand still clinging to her boots. Those moments were burned into her as deeply as the ink itself. She remembered how the artist had said, "You sure you want this? It'll be with you forever." And she had nodded without hesitation. That was the point. Every scar, every mark, every sleepless night was tied to that emblem. It wasn't art. It was a declaration of who she had become. When the commander saw it, when his eyes softened with recognition, it wasn't because he saw rebellion. It was because he saw the same history reflected back at him. He'd known the symbol once, maybe even the people behind it. The ink connected them in ways no rank or insignia ever could. The tattoo wasn't meant to challenge authority. It was meant to honor what came before it. It held the names of the fallen in its curves, the memory of promises kept and broken, the reminder that even when the uniform was gone, duty remained. It wasn't defiance. It was legacy written in silence. And in that moment, standing beneath the fluorescent lights, surrounded by unspoken judgment, the story behind it pulsed quietly beneath her skin, waiting to be understood. The room had shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious, but everyone could feel it. The tension that once pushed down like a weight had turned into something else, uncertain, questioning. The commander's eyes were still on her, but not with the sharpness of authority. There was recognition in his gaze, the kind that comes when memory collides with the present. The others in the room didn't understand what was happening, but they felt the change. The energy had moved from accusation to something quieter, deeper. She hadn't spoken a word, yet everything about her posture told a story that words couldn't carry. The commander took another step forward, his face unreadable, but the air seemed to soften around him. The officer who had given the order stood frozen, unsure whether to continue enforcing it or to step back. His confidence wavered, his authority suddenly fragile under the weight of the commander's silence. She stood there, back exposed just enough for the tattoo to be seen clearly, her hands still hovering near her uniform. She didn't plead or explain. She didn't have to. The ink spoke for her. The commander's eyes moved slowly, tracing the familiar curves of the emblem. He had seen it once, years ago, in a briefing room filled with smoke and maps and names written on whiteboards that would later be erased. It had been the symbol of a unit that didn't exist anymore, one that had been written out of reports, but not from memory. The faces of those who wore it flashed across his mind, the long nights, the impossible missions, the silence that followed loss. He remembered giving the final order that disbanded them, the look in their eyes when he told them it was over. He had thought he'd buried that part of his life with the paperwork, but now it stood in front of him, alive, breathing, carrying that mark with unshakable pride. Something in his chest tightened, not regret, but something close to it. The tattoo wasn't just a memory for her. It was a bridge back to everything they'd endured. He realized then that she wasn't defying authority by wearing the uniform. She was honoring the ones who never came home. The mark on her back wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of remembrance, and by extension, of loyalty. The same loyalty that the institution claimed to value but sometimes forgot to recognize when it didn't fit inside the rules. The silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was full of understanding, a quiet conversation happening without sound. She stood steady, her chin lifted just enough to show she wasn't broken. The commander finally looked away from the tattoo and met her eyes. What he saw there stopped him, not defiance, not fear, but calm strength. The kind forged in moments when you have nothing left but your principles. He took a slow breath, the kind that carried both realization and decision. The officer next to him shifted, uncertain, waiting for an order that didn't come. The commander's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces watching the scene. He could see confusion, discomfort, curiosity. None of them knew the story behind that mark, but they all knew that something had changed. The authority that had demanded obedience a few minutes earlier now felt small against the quiet gravity of that moment. The commander nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and the officer beside him lowered his eyes. No one said it out loud, but the command to remove the uniform was gone, erased not by words but by understanding. She hadn't needed to argue or plead her case. The truth of who she was, what she'd endured, had spoken louder than any defense could. She exhaled, slow and steady, barely noticeable, but enough to ease the tightness in her shoulders. For the first time since the order had been given, she felt the air return to her lungs. The silence that had once isolated her now felt shared, as if the room itself had been forced to acknowledge something sacred. She didn't smile, didn't move, didn't seek validation. She simply stood there, grounded, unshaken. The commander's attention lingered on her a moment longer, then shifted back to the others. There was no speech, no apology, no correction. But the tone of the room had changed permanently. The unspoken message was clear: respect, once earned, could not be revoked by misunderstanding. The uniform she wore was no longer just fabric. It had become a symbol again, reclaimed through quiet defiance and unwavering dignity. The younger soldiers in the room glanced between her and the commander, realizing something important had just taken place, even if they didn't yet understand it. They saw what it meant to stand your ground without raising your voice, to hold on to your truth even when authority questioned it. They saw the difference between power that demands obedience and leadership that recognizes honor. She didn't need thanks, and he didn't offer any. The acknowledgement existed in silence, a shared understanding between two soldiers who had lived through different wars but carried the same scars. The commander gave one last look, not of permission but of respect, the kind that couldn't be written into regulations or earned through rank. The order was never repeated. No one mentioned it again. But everyone who witnessed that moment would remember how quickly judgment had turned to reverence, how misunderstanding had given way to recognition. It wasn't the kind of turning point marked by grand gestures or loud declarations. It was the quiet kind, the kind that reshapes everything without needing to be spoken. When the moment finally settled, the room felt different. The air that once carried tension now held something softer, steadier, something that felt like understanding. The order had vanished without words, replaced by a quiet respect that couldn't be commanded or written into any manual. She stood there, still and composed, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to defend herself. The uniform on her body, the tattoo beneath it, and the silence surrounding her had all blended into one truth. That identity isn't granted by authority, it's built through what you survive. As the commander turned slightly, the light shifted, brushing across her face. There was no victory in her expression, only calm. What she felt wasn't triumph but validation, a reminder that the things that define a person, loyalty, sacrifice, integrity, don't depend on who's watching or what rules say. The uniform was never just a symbol of compliance. It was a language of belonging. And now, even stripped of certainty, it meant something again. The others in the room didn't speak. They didn't need to. Each of them had seen something that changed the way they looked at the uniform on their own backs. It wasn't about hierarchy or orders anymore. It was about the people who wore it, their stories, their pain, their resilience. The commander's silence had said more than any explanation could. Respect wasn't something you demanded with authority. It was something you earned through understanding. She adjusted the collar of her uniform, her fingers steady. The fabric, which had moments ago felt heavy with judgment, now felt light again. It fit differently, not because it had changed, but because she had reclaimed what it represented. The ink beneath it pressed warm against her skin, a reminder of everything that had brought her to this point. Her past wasn't something to be hidden or erased. It was what gave meaning to every salute, every order, every step she took on that base. Identity wasn't about what was approved. It was about what endured. The tattoo wasn't just a story about where she had been. It was a reflection of who she still was, a soldier, a survivor, a bearer of memory. And though the commander hadn't said a word, His recognition had done something that words could never do. It had restored what bureaucracy had taken, dignity. The young recruits nearby shifted uneasily, unsure what to make of what they'd seen. They'd been trained to follow commands without hesitation, to read regulations like scripture. But now they saw that not everything that mattered could be written down. They saw a woman who had been ordered to remove her uniform stand her ground with nothing but silence and truth. They saw a commander acknowledge her without needing to speak. And somewhere deep inside, they began to understand what the uniform truly meant. It wasn't about fabric or insignia. It wasn't about ranks stitched into sleeves or names etched onto badges. It was about what those things stood for, the sacrifices made when no one was watching, the bonds that outlasted missions, the quiet courage that never made it into reports. The uniform was supposed to represent honor, but sometimes it took moments like this to remind everyone what honor actually looked like. She didn't think about punishment anymore, or consequences. She wasn't afraid of being written up or questioned again. She'd stood in front of authority and refused to let it rewrite her truth. That kind of strength didn't come from defiance. It came from knowing who you were when everything else was stripped away. The commander watched her for another moment, then turned his attention to the others. His face stayed calm, but there was something different in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that he'd been reminded of something important. The system could write rules, but it couldn't define character. The people in that room had seen it for themselves. They'd seen that respect wasn't in compliance, but in conviction. She remained still as the others began to move again, the rhythm of the room slowly returning. The sound of boots on the floor echoed differently now, less mechanical, more deliberate. The atmosphere no longer felt heavy with discipline. It felt grounded in purpose. She straightened her shoulders, not as an act of defiance, but as an affirmation of who she was. The tattoo remained hidden once more beneath the uniform, unseen but not forgotten. Its story had been told without being spoken, its meaning understood without explanation. It lived quietly beneath the surface, just like the values it represented: sacrifice, loyalty, identity. Those things couldn't be ordered away, couldn't be erased with a command. They stayed with her, as much a part of her as breath and heartbeat. Every soldier in that room would leave remembering the image. The moment authority met integrity, and integrity didn't flinch. They'd carry it with them, maybe without realizing it, into every mission, every order, every moment of doubt. Because what they'd witnessed wasn't about rule-breaking. It was about truth, about what it means to serve not because you're told to, but because you believe in something larger than yourself. The uniform might fade someday. The rank might change. The ink might blur. But what it all stood for, the courage to stand tall, the will to remember, the quiet pride in doing what's right even when no one approves, would remain, stitched into memory, carried forward in silence, just like the mark beneath her skin.